Who you put your trust in matters. Investors have put their trust in independent registered investment advisors to the tune of $4 trillion. Why? Learn more at findyourindependengadvisor.com.
Welcome to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Tom Keene with David Gura. Daily, we bring you insight from the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. Find Bloomberg Surveillance on iTunes, SoundCloud, Bloomberg.com, and of course, on the Bloomberg.
Our first guest this morning, Sheila Bair, former chair of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, now the president of Washington College. And Sheila, it's great to have you with us again.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start with personnel. We are so focused here on who Donald Trump is going to appoint for what. Are we overplaying the role of these personnel picks at this point in the transition?
Well, no, I think the personnel picks are very important, especially in the financial regulatory agencies. You know, Dodd-Frank, for all the rhetoric about Dodd-Frank, it really was just a big grant of authority to the Secretary of Treasury and the head of the various federal regulators, so financial regulators. So I do think these appointments are very key in terms of what kinds of policies we'll be pursuing going forward.
Sheila, what do we know about the way Donald Trump makes these appointments? He's been favoring loyalists so far. Will that change?
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know the gentleman, and it strikes me that he's that kind of personality that's going to be giving high priority to people who supported him and were loyal to him during the campaign, and so that's good. I think appointments can also, some should include unity appointments. Obviously, all of them you want high-quality, experienced people who will be able to be effective in their jobs. But it does strike me that he's a person that puts a high premium on loyalty.
You've written this open letter to Donald Trump. You're now the president of Washington College, and
Right.
in that capacity interact a lot with young people. And I wonder sort of what prompted you to do that, and sort of what you're calling upon him to do.
Well, I do think that there were actually two things in the letter. One was, and others have suggested that, I think students, particularly students of color, are somewhat fearful. There was a lot of heated rhetoric during the campaign. They're fearful that Mr. Trump's election could be interpreted by some as a ratification of biased sentiments. I don't think that's what Mr. Trump stands for, what his presidency stands for, but that's certainly a perception. And some of our students are fearful, and I think to the extent he could make strong statements against bias, against harassment, intimidation of any kind, against students of color or other groups that have been historically discriminated against, that would be reassuring, you know, and everybody in the country is hurting. I think that's one of the sad things about this election, is it did so profoundly break out on racial lines, because really working families, whether you're white or whether you're a person of color, people have been struggling. And I think it was that constituency who he's trying to reach, I hope sincerely so, and will help the working class, where we've not had very robust good job growth until lately, virtually no improvement in real wages. So that middle class segment is really who he's trying to reach, and I think that should be a unifying theme, and hopefully he can reinforce that through his public statements. But I do think he needs to make very, very strong statements against discrimination, intimidation, harassment in any form. I think students across the country would find that reassuring.
And Sheila, do you see this coming? It seems that with his latest tweets talking about serious voter fraud in Virginia, New Hampshire, and California, about the popular vote, he doesn't seem like a president-elect who really wants to unify the country. Am I wrong?
Yeah, well, I hope. I want to still give him the benefit of the doubt. I think his victory speech was a very good one. It sounded sincere to me. It sounded unifying. He said he wanted to be the president of all Americans. He was going to be the president of all Americans. So I hope that's the Donald Trump we see. I hope he and his advisors will be very careful in terms of thinking how his words could be interpreted by some as threatening or intimidating. And that's absolutely the wrong signal we want to send to people, especially young people in our country.
Sheila, let me ask you about your sense of what regulation is going to look like under a Donald Trump presidency. Of course, Mary Jo White, the head of the SEC, saying she's going to step down at the end of President Obama's term. A number of vacancies there. But we're really looking at sort of a full-scale personnel overhaul across the regulatory agencies. What's your sense of, your understanding of what regulation is going to look like?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm hoping we'll see smart regulation, not no regulation. I think we tried the no regulation, very light touch, relying on self-correcting markets, which clearly didn't work prior to the crisis. So you do need some strong common sense regulation, which I hope he preserves. Things like stronger capital requirements. I think everybody, conservative, liberal, progressive, libertarian, everybody understands that these large financial institutions were relying far too much on borrowed money. They needed to have more common equity, more skin in the game that would give them better incentives to temper risk-taking, and also to align economic incentives and have a cushion to absorb losses if you get into a downturn, which they didn't have. So I'm hoping, at least on really basic things like capital, he continues course and actually strengthens them. And that's something Jeb Hensarling, while he would deregulate in other areas, has pushed for much stronger capital requirements as a trade-off for less regulation in other areas. So I hope that that's what he'll pursue. Where the party's going to be and whether his administration is going to be on Glass-Steagall, that was in the party platform. I don't know to what extent he feels committed to that. But that is, again, bipartisan. There's a lot of bipartisan interest in restoring Glass-Steagall and dividing, particularly investment banking and commercial banking once again. So I do think in terms of financial regulation, you need to make a distinction as to where he might go in other areas. But we tried no regulation prior to the crisis. Ironically, I think this very light-touch regulatory environment that brought us the crisis is in large part responsible for getting him elected. I think there's a backlash continuing against the crisis, the bailouts that followed, the sense that there was one set of rules for the big banks, another set of rules for everybody else. So that helped propel him to the White House, and it would be really ironic if he created a regulatory environment that gave us this excessive risk-taking and brought us another crisis again. I hope that's not what happened.
Right. And Sheila, this is, when we talk about deregulation, we talk about Wall Street, we talk about big banks, but actually we talk about also the oil sector, a whole loads of sector. If you deregulate too much, does it not actually amplify inequality?
Well, it could. It very well could. And ironically, a lot of the policies, I think unintentionally, but a lot of the policies that were pursued in the current administration did tremendously help the wealthy and large corporations. You implement, if you use monetary policy to try to stimulate the economy, which is basically what we've done for the past 8 years, what you have is a situation where very wealthy people benefit because financial assets, their value is inflated. It's very easy for large corporations to access the debt markets to raise funding, much harder for smaller entities that rely on bank lending with these very low interest rates to access the credit that they need. So I do hope that all policies that he pursues are evaluated through the prism of how this is going to impact the working class, and that is who got him elected. And, more of the same where we just really, whether it's under different guise, but we just continue helping those who have the haves already. I don't think that's going to be good politically or good for the economy. You need a growing middle class to have a healthy economy, and we have not had that for several years now.
Sheila, you mentioned the party platform and Glass-Steagall and all of that. You, a registered Republican, have you emerged from this campaign, this election, with a different sense of your allegiance to that party, or does it stay the same? In other words, have you had to reckon with that at all?
Yeah. Well, I did. I was very troubled by a lot of the statements that were made during the campaign. I actually voted for the Libertarian ticket. My son actually convinced me he's a Libertarian, and as a bit of a vote, a wake-up vote to the Republican Party, I do think we need to be a party of inclusion, a big tent, not a small tent party. Again, I'm hopeful, given his acceptance speech, that is the direction Mr. Trump is going to pursue. So I really think this is make it or break it time, though. We have we had very strong electoral results. Both the presidency as well as both houses of Congress are now under Republican control. We have an opportunity to change policies in a way that are going to help our economy and help our middle class. And I think there are good Republican ways through tax reform where you lower the top rates, but you also broaden the base so you don't lose a lot of revenue. I think you can do smart infrastructure spending through policies that take advantage of these low interest rates, which we haven't done, but also rely on user fees, or there's been proposals to, windfalls associated with repatriating a lot of the overseas income that's been trapped because of our ill-advised tax policies, using some of that to pay for infrastructure.
Sheila?
I think there's ways you can provide stimulus without blowing a hole in the budget.
Sheila, thank you so much. Sheila Bair, the Washington College president. This is Bloomberg.
Fidel Castro passed away over the weekend, longtime leader of Cuba. Joining us now to talk more about him, his legacy, and what happens next to Cuba-U.S. relations is Julia Zweig. She's Senior Research Fellow at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, author of Cuba, What Everyone Needs to Know. Julia, great to speak with you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking the time. Give us a sense of the significance here. Of course, Fidel Castro had ceded a lot of administrative responsibility to his brother. What does this mean going forward? In other words, how does the country pick up from here?
Well, you're correct. Really, for the better part of the last 10 years, Fidel Castro has been not entirely off the political stage, but certainly off the stage of governance and government and policy guidance, and really off the political stage for the last few years. So this does not portend any kind of earthquake or radical change in terms of how Cuba is run, in terms of the economic reform process that Raul Castro started about 5 or 6 years ago. So I think it's important your audience understand that his death has very significant symbolic importance, but in terms of the day-to-day and the tomorrow, I don't foresee any major changes. Not yet.
Julia, what will his legacy be? You see low levels of crime. You see high rates of literacy. At the same time, he, really squandered a lot of the country's enormous economic potential.
Yes, well, that legacy you summed up well, and I would add something else, which is that he spent a lot of resources on health and education for the Cuban people, on elevating Cuba's standing culturally, internationally, and on putting Cuba on the geopolitical map for many, many decades, especially during the Cold War. But because of his extreme allergy to the market, to capitalism, and to the way he associated with capitalism with the United States, its imperial dominance in Latin America, he delayed for a long time Cuba's potential development, which is what Raul Castro is now trying to harness and pick up very rapidly before he himself, or at least launched Cuba on a new economic path, before he himself steps down in 2018.
Does Fidel Castro's legacy loom less large in Latin America than it once did? You look at who he influences among other leaders in the continent?
Well, that's a good question. You know, we've had a shift in Latin America just in the last year, going from kind of center-left populism to a more centrist, center-right orientation. But, you know, it's not so long ago that Hugo Chavez was running Venezuela. Evo Morales is still in Bolivia. His legacy in Latin America, I would argue, is enormous. Even Cuba, for example, having hosted peace talks in Colombia for Colombia and the FARC rebels, the Colombian government for the last several years, culminating quite recently in the conclusion of the negotiated peace and the stand down of the FARC insurgency. That orientation, the impulse that Fidel had to first bring revolution to Latin America, which he did, and then to pull back and back peaceful transitions in those countries, that's very significant. And the emphasis that he put in Latin America on pointing out inequality, poverty, pointing out how U.S. policy in the region for many, many decades held back so many Latin Americans, he became a huge symbol, not only to people that supported him, but to people that opposed him. His influence was just huge.
What do we know about, his brother Raul? So he's been the president since 2008. He's not really a liberal, or is he?
No, no. Raul Castro was a member of the Communist Youth Party in Cuba before Fidel Castro even got close to the communists. He went to the Soviet Union when he was in his 20s. But, once they took power in 1959 and he became head of the Armed Forces, Minister of Defense, and especially beginning in the 1980s as the Soviet bloc collapsed and after into the 1990s, it was Raul Castro who looked around and said, I'm going to start training some of my guys in the military to run capitalist enterprises. And he was the one who had far less a visceral rejection to market economies, and he, I think, sees them today as head of state as essential to being able to take advantage and move Cuba up the value-added chain internationally. He's kind of an eyes-wide-open guy, very pragmatic in terms of the world that Cuba exists in and what Cuba needs in order to preserve the legacy of health and education and autonomous foreign policy that Fidel started. That doesn't make him a liberal. It makes him, I think, grounded in a kind of national interest realpolitik approach to Cuba's future.
Julia, thank you very much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. That's Julia Swag. She's Senior Research Fellow at Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, the author of Cuba, What Everyone Needs to Know, of course, as we mark the death of Fidel Castro, longtime leader of Cuba. He passed away on Friday.
Who you put your trust in matters. Investors have put their trust in independent registered investment advisors to the tune of $4 trillion. Why? They see their role as to serve, not sell. That's why Charles Schwab is committed to the success of over 7,000 independent financial advisors who passionately dedicate themselves to helping people achieve their financial goals. Learn more at findyourindependengadvisor.com.
I'm looking at the most recent cover of Foreign Affairs here, with apologies to Grant Wood, American Gothic Redux here, Farmer and his wife, he with his signature pitchfork and a Make America Great hat on as well. The editor of that magazine joins us now, Gideon Rose, the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, Peter G. Peterson, chair of the Council on Foreign Relations, here to talk a bit about populism at a time when we're all wondering what it is exactly. And Michael Kaysen, in his piece for the magazine, Gideon, really getting to the heart of this. This is sort of an ineffable thing. A lot of people have laid claim to the term populist.
So, I think that you just talked about anger rooms coming to the States. I think that's actually a good analogy, right? The entire country becomes an anger room in which you trash everything because you're not happy with the way things are going. So populism has several historical strands, but it's basically a feeling that the ordinary people are getting screwed, and they're either getting screwed by elites primarily, but also there's sometimes the feeling that they're getting screwed by the people below them who look different and are at the even bottom rungs of the totem pole. So the Trump phenomenon seems to mix both of those things, right? You have anger at elites who are supposedly self-dealing and profit-taking and keeping the goodies for themselves and running the system the way they want to, but also anger at the perceived others, different, brown, darker, different religion, foreign nationality people who are coming in, taking jobs, taking benefits, etc. And so there's a kind of fire trained both up and down at the elite and at the people at the true bottom.
Gideon, do people know what they're angry about? And I guess it's only by looking at the root of the problem then that our politicians can actually fix it. Is it immigration? Is it globalization? Is it being lost with technology, technological advances?
So there's a classic Marlon Brando movie back in the 50s, I think it was called The Wild One, and he's asked, at one point he plays this sort of motorcycle guy, what are you rebelling against? And his response is, what do you got? So at this point there's a general inchoate anger room trash everything, and it's not clear that anybody even knows what exactly. Look, there have been a whole lot of failures. There's been a failure to distribute the proceeds of growth. This is the whole economic inequality stuff that we've been talking about. Not just, the odd thing is Donald Trump and Occupy Wall Street have something in common, a belief that the proceeds of the gains of the last generation or two of globalization have gone to a small elite at the top. There's also cultural change, demographic change, a country in which it seems like there are newly empowered groups. And there's also just a feeling that jobs and trade and manufacturing sector and that there really isn't much of a role in the economy for non-skilled people working in manufacturing.
Where does this end? Because if everybody rebels, then we're left with a pretty scary world 3-4 years from now. I remember the day after Donald Trump got elected, listening to some of the foreign news, and a Saudi reporter actually saying, well, people are fed up in the Middle East as well, and they would probably vote for Islamic State at the moment as a protest vote if they could. Well,
this is a great big question. We really don't know, and it's in fact the uncertainty that in many ways is the scariest kind of thing. So I remember asking a friend on Wall Street back about 8 years ago at this time, sort of why is everything so crazy? Why are markets so freaked? And he said, look, there's a 20% chance of a depression, maybe, and we're all freaked out about that. And I said, well, okay, well, that's bad, but that means there's an 80% chance of no depression, right? So why isn't that good? He said, you don't understand. A year ago, if you'd said, what is the chance of a depression? I would have said 0. The fact that it's up to 20%, that's freaking us all out. So in the same kind of way, what Trump has, and Trump voters and the Trump campaign has put forward, like a lot of other populists, is literally a sort of tear the whole system down, get rid of the post-war order, stop trade agreements, stop alliances, do all sorts of things differently. And if they actually put any of that into actual practice, it would cause a national and geopolitical and international catastrophe. But we don't know if they're actually going to do any of that. So right now there's this chance that the world could be burned down, but we don't actually know. So I think it's still an unlikely possibility, but it'll depend on what they believed. What they said they actually believed,
sure.
What they said that they believed they actually care about, and what sort of pushback they get from domestic, international, bureaucratic, and other actors. And we just haven't seen any of that yet.
Last question here, just about the brand of populism that we're seeing right now as you assemble this magazine, not just looking at the U.S., but the whole world. Is the same? Is it the same what we've seen in the U.K., in the U.S., what we're seeing in other parts of Europe right now, perhaps what we've seen in Colombia? Are we looking at the same kind of populism?
Well, this is a fascinating question, and I think the answer is they share some familial similarities, but they're not exactly the same. It's interesting. There's a kind of ethno-nationalism. Now, in one sense, it's kind of weird because why would ethno-nationalists in one country agree with ethno-nationalists in another country from a different nationalist group, a different ethnos? But the fact is they all seem to rebel against the cosmopolitan elite. And so what you have is a kind of sense that immigration has gone too far, economic globalization has gone too far, cultural homogenization has gone too far, and everybody's screaming and trashing the room. But it's not entirely clear how correlated these movements are and how much there actually is a broader ideology.
Gideon Rose, thank you very much. Editor of Foreign Affairs, Peter G. Peterson, Chair at the Council on Foreign Relations, the new issue of Foreign Affairs, The Power of Populism. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio. David Gurr with Francine Lockwood today. Well, many people trying to define, put their finger on what Trump economics is. Among them, Bill Lee. He's managing director and head of North America Economics at Citigroup. Has a new note on that out, and he joins us now. Hey, Bill, how you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
A line stood out to me in your most recent note. You said a mercurial temperament is one feature of President-elect Trump's behavior that we can expect to raise policy uncertainty. It makes me think it must be incredibly difficult at this point to forecast out given all of the uncertainty.
Very much so, and I think a lot of my colleagues in the marketplace have got it wrong. Everyone is anticipating, oh my God, we're going to get all this massive fiscal stimulus, and that means that rates have to go up, but inflation is going to have to go up, and we think that will happen, but not until 2018 or even later. So one of the textbook examples that we always give our clients now is that remember when the teacher said, when we anticipate fiscal policy, markets react immediately. That means rates go up, the dollar goes up, and what does that produce? Drag. And so what we've done for the forecast for 2017 is actually mark it down because of that market reaction.
Right, but Bill, so why do you think that he won't be able to spend or reflate the economy as fast as markets seem to think? Is it because he doesn't have the houses with him, because they're fiscal hawks, or a lot of them are? Is it the dollar strength, or is it just the fact that actually you need a lot more to reflate the U.S.?
Well, he's been pretty tricky in sort of what he's talked about so far. All this talk, for example, of infrastructure spending, he said, well, what we're going to do is to try to get the private sector to come in, and we're going to give them tax credits for 80 cents on every dollar they put into the infrastructure. Well, that means a lot of toll roads and bridges, new toll roads and bridges, but that does not mean repairing LaGuardia Airport or a lot of the decaying bridges that have no tolls on it. So the needed infrastructure spending that we all envision is not the kind of infrastructure spending that the Trump program currently has in mind. When we talk about tax cuts, we're talking likely about the lowering of corporate tax rates and the lowering of personal tax rates. Well, what's the one characteristic about tax cuts? Unless they're guaranteed to be permanent, people are going to save a lot of it because the uncertainty of whether or not the tax policy gets reversed or not causes people to be more cautious. And we're seeing that in consumers' households today where the savings rates are higher, and we're seeing it in the corporate behavior because what are they doing with all the excess profits? They're giving it back to shareholders in dividends and stock buybacks. So these are the kind of forces that are still there and still operating even with the Trump policies in place.
Bill, is it your sense here that the debate is over as to whether or not we'll have a stimulus package, as to whether or not we'll get these tax cuts? Is the horse out of the barn there, or are we destined to have them whether or not it makes economic sense?
I think one of the things that the markets are optimistic about, and certainly I'm optimistic about, is that we have what might be the closest we've come to a unified government in ages. And so if they don't do it now, when can they do it? And if in fact what distinguishes us from what's going on in Europe is that in Europe we still see the balkanization of politics leading to balkanization of economic policy, which leads to fiscal policy going nowhere. Here we have some inkling that maybe all of the popular unrest is now expressed itself, and that means that the mandate is given to Congress and to the president, do something. And what we don't know about is what that something is, and so we think the tax cuts are in play because, as you say, the horse is out of the barn. Now, how much of a tax cut and how long will it last, that's what's unknown.
But why is Europe any different? In Europe, we went through austerity, and this was the one thing that actually, we heard over and over and over. And we had Mario Draghi, press conference after press conference saying, guys, we need fiscal stimulus. Why can Europe not wake up, look at Donald Trump, and say, actually, you know what, guys, we're going to do the same?
Because the political horizon for a lot of the needed reforms in Europe, structural reforms, improving labor market efficiency, getting rid of a lot of the regulatory burden, especially on smaller businesses in, say, Italy, those rules take about 5 to 10 years to put in place, another 5 to 10 years before they take hold. Remember that other Super Mario brother that no one seems to be talking about anymore, Mario Monti? He actually put in a lot of structural reforms. So what happened to him? After 1 year, he got blown out. Now, Renzi is surely trying to implement a lot of those reforms, but it's at a snail's pace, and because the mandate isn't there. Here in the U.S., we have not had the opportunity, I think, to put in the needed reforms, but now there seems to be the likelihood that we could start that way, especially with deregulation. Right. And if that proceeds, and especially if we can cut back on a lot of the executive orders that Obama put in place, because he's used most often the executive orders to put in place regulatory policies, reversing that might put in the structural reforms more quickly than what we saw in Europe.
All right, Bill, let's come back. Bill Lee, they're Managing Director, Head of North American Economics at Citigroup. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Bill, we were talking a little bit about populism. You were telling us that actually you disagree with a lot of your counterparts, that Donald Trump will not be able to reflate the economy as soon as the markets are expecting. The OECD lifted its global growth forecast. Are you expecting something ugly out there? Again, is it because of dollar strength? Will the Fed be able to hike in December and then twice next year?
Actually, I think that a lot of the source of the global economy coming back online have to do with a lot of the emerging market countries, especially some of the big ones coming out of recession. So I think that's a good sign, but it's not the kind of growth that would be a driver for the global economy. The only driver I see out there is still the U.S. economy, and there again, the timing of everything is really critical. The market reaction is putting on drag on the U.S. economy right now, and for 2017, certainly through the first half, and it won't be until we see the tax cuts come into play, which probably will take the legislatures into 2018 before we actually see it having an impact on the U.S. Actual spending. So really the question that I'm raising here is whether or not the markets can see through the drag that we see in the immediate future for the possibility of that higher growth coming online in 2018 and beyond. So what our forecast has done is to mark down 2017 to like 1.8 from what it used to be at 2.1 before the election, and then we pushed up 2018 to about 2.5%. And there again, it is a mild kind of a boost because we're just not sure how much of a package can really be put through Congress.
How much does, I asked this of Sheila Bair a few minutes ago, how much personnel matters? We're paying rapt attention here to all the speculation about who Donald Trump might pick. But, to be fair, if he picks Steve Mnuchin to run the Treasury Department, we really don't know much about how Steve Mnuchin will run the Treasury Department.
Precisely, and that's why I'm reluctant to put in play sort of the numbers that are being bandied around about fiscal spending and tax cuts. I am putting in some of that stuff, but we will see, and I think our forecasts will have to evolve as we learn more about not just what the broad outlines are, but actually what the actual policies that will be put in play by the people who are going to be put in spots that we have yet to find out about. So I think that's the source of uncertainty, and the one thing that uncertainty absolutely really guarantees is that people will delay decisions. They will delay spending decisions for infrastructure, investment, and consumption, and that means drag. So the one thing you know for sure is that we're going to have a drag on the immediate level of economic activity.
Which means what exactly, Bill? That actually consumers feel a little bit less confident about the future so that they spend a little bit less, or is it CEOs that are actually holding back from investing?
Exactly, Francine. Look at what happened with our Black Friday. I mean, that was supposed to be the best day of the year, and it came in under where it was last year. That, to me, is absolutely no surprise in this environment where, yes, we have the prospect of something really good happening, but we just don't know what shape the good stuff might be. And so what do? You just save a little bit more because just in case things might not turn out the way they are supposed to.
You know, the thing we've heard the least about, I think, since the election results were in is about trade. Perhaps about immigration, but about trade as well. And these are the big X factors. So at this point, do you take what the now president-elect said on the campaign trail at face, or how do you begin to process sort of what might happen with regard to trade, with regard to immigration?
Question. Thank you for that. The silver lining I see that's being developing since the day of the election, the one thing Donald Trump did that was incredibly smart was to come out the minute he got elected and say, you know, we may not have a trade war. I really want to bring China to negotiate. You know, I'm not going to throw out millions and millions of people. I'm just going to go after the people with criminal records. That clarity, I think, was the best thing he could do to calm the markets, because now we know that a lot of the policies that he's talked about on the campaign trail are targeted. And the more targeted they are, the better off we, in general, will be, because we now can plan around whatever he's targeting. And he can build as much of a wall as he wants, but as long as he doesn't disrupt the labor market with the new immigration policy or new trade policy by declaring tariffs and wars and things like that, that's the fear that I have been warning people about before. And from the day of his election result, he has been essentially giving us more details about targeting his campaign claims.
Right, and Bill, you're sure that this is the way it will be, because I'm looking at his tweets, right? He's talking about serious voter fraud. He's talking about the fact that he would have won the so-called popular vote. To me, it seems like a president like that's very uncertain, or that's very hot-headed, and could actually reverse some of the things that he said to the New York Times just last week.
You're absolutely right, and that's why I said the one thing I know for sure is more uncertainty. And so what do you do in the face of uncertainty? Do less and do it later. So I know the Twitter wars mean nothing other than a higher degree of uncertainty and transparency into the uncertainty than we've ever seen before. We don't have the traditional policy wonk filters that the staff would do for the president, and so I think that's the new regime that we're going to have to learn to live with.
Bill, how are policymakers processing all of this? We have the next Fed meeting here in, 3 weeks' time. Is their game here to wait this out to see what happens with regard to stimulus, with regard to tax cuts, or are they going to sort of push ahead, paying no attention to what may or may not happen?
Well, being a former Fed staffer and a guy who used to sit at the table when we did the forecast meetings at the board, the one thing I know they're going to do, they're going to turn to the fiscal guy and say, so what do you think? And they're going to ask exactly the same question you just asked me, and the fiscal guy is going to respond the way I just responded, which is to say, beats me. Your guess is as good as mine. And because of that, I'm going to use as much of current policy as I know is going to be in play and probably give you the contingencies around it. And looks like the contingencies for trade and immigration are less bad than they were the day before the election. And I think the fiscal policy spending will be less robust than what we think because of the way the financing is being arranged. And the big unknown is whether the tax cuts can get in play in a way that will be perceived as permanent. Those are the discussions around the board table right before the next FOMC meeting.
But Bill, what do you mean? I mean, tax cuts overall, or is it tax cuts to repatriate some of the money that is currently overseas?
Good point, Francine. The one thing that I think there's a lot of consensus about on both sides of the aisle is to bring back those corporate profits, because that is one way of financing a lot of the spending that might be put in play, and some of the other tax cuts. So we think that actually in 2017 we will see that tax cut being put in place, because that's the one thing that they want, which is a way of bringing back corporate profits. Now that I think because it is a temporary one-time benefit, will probably not really affect spending all that much. A lot of that money will come in. There'll be tax revenues for the government. And by the way the arcane accounting is done, that is considered a revenue loss because the way they score the tax bill is to say, well, they would have brought it back at a higher tax rate at some point in the future. Now we have to bill it at a much lower tax rate. So the minutia of how Congress perceives that tax cut is not that tax cut and the profits that come back is not extra source of revenue, but in fact they score it as a tax loss, and that's the minutia that has to be worked out.
Bill, very quick here, looking at the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index at 1015, up a little bit, stronger a little bit. How long do you expect the stronger dollar story to continue?
Well, our own in-house view is that there's a 8 to 10% rise in the dollar from the time of the election onward. A lot of that is already put in play, and so I think that if it were to go up 8 to 10%, that is enough to generate easily about a quarter to half point of drag on the U.S. economy. So we'll see if that carries out or not. That's our baseline forecast.
That's William Lee there. Bill Lee, Managing Director and Head of North American Economics at Citigroup. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Subscribe and listen to interviews on iTunes, SoundCloud, or whichever podcast platform you prefer. I'm out on Twitter at Tom Keene. David Gura is at David Gura. Before the podcast, you can always catch us worldwide on Bloomberg Radio.
Who you put your trust in matters. Investors have put their trust in independent registered investment advisors to the tune of $4 trillion. Why? Learn more at findyourindependentadvisor.com.